Hello there, Rafael. How are you?
I'm doing great, Yvonne. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. And hi, Alex. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, nice to be here.
So, today, well, everybody knows, I think that, well, let's back up. I'm in Panama today. So, we talked about this last year. I'm now splitting time between Tampa and Panama. So, today I'm in Panama. It's warm and overcast a little bit, but it's very nice. Ralph, you're in Tampa. How is it in Tampa?
It's beautiful today. We got 50s in the morning, but I think it's in the 70s now, so it's very nice here.
Nice. And Alex, you are joining us from?
Oakland, California, where today it's a little overcast and it was chilly this morning, but warming up a little bit.
Very nice. So you are not a new guest. You've been on our podcast before. Thank you for joining us again.
It's nice
Believe
to
it
be
or
back.
not, thank you. Believe it or not, this is the kickoff to season 5. This is our 5th season.
Wow.
So yeah, that's what Ralph was. How did we get here? But you are president of CWCI, the California Workers' Compensation Institute.
Yes.
And today we're going to talk about the history of workers' compensation. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about that. Ralph and I have already kind of explained that this year we're taking a little bit of a twist with our podcast. We're going to go back to our original idea, which is to break down this awesome, wonderful system that we work in, but break it down into bite-sized chunks so folks can really understand what it's all about, particularly those people that are coming into the industry new.
Yes.
So tell us, Alex, Ralph and I talk about this a lot, and, we both have kids that are around the same age, in their 20s, and they'll often say to us, why do you guys have to talk about history so much? Why do you have to beat the dead horse? So, Alex, why do you think it's important for us to understand the history and the beginnings of our workers' compensation system?
I think personally speaking, it's just endlessly fascinating. It is our country's oldest social benefit. It predates Social Security and Medicare and Medi-Cal, and it was critical in helping us to complete the pivot, the national pivot, from what was a largely agrarian society to an industrial base without being just swamped by lawsuits and other industrial calamities. So it played a really important role around the turn of the prior century to helping us land at a more productive environment.
Awesome. So, Ralph, what are your thoughts? We've talked about this back and forth, but you think it's important to study the history, right?
As we have gotten older and have seen all of the 50 states systems, I think it becomes even more important to know that history, to really figure out where have we been and why are we making these changes today? And what was the basis of it back then and why did it evolve to where it's at today? And then moving forward, we really learn a great deal about what we did right and what we did wrong from that history to be able to continue to improve the system. So I think it's incredibly important to know it, understand it, and really own it, right? Really absorb it to be able to then be productive here and figure out what the answers are.
Okay,
Well said.
so yes, thank you, Ralph. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Alex. You've got a short presentation for us here, so go ahead and take it away.
Great. I'd like to just start by saying, adding on to your first question, that the workers' compensation system as we know it, as we've been studying it, as we've been living in it, did not fall from the sky. It has been developing and evolving and changing to meet the needs of an evolving and changing work environment. And I think it's helpful to step back and look at where our system began and how it has evolved and all the fingers that were involved in creating the environment that we work at today. So I'll just start with a personal story. I work in California, but I grew up in New York City, and I left when I was a teenager. but my wife and I and our family, we like to go back to New York fairly often. And a few years ago, we were back in New York for a conference, and we had some time off, and we went for a walk in Greenwich Village, in the Washington Square Park area of Greenwich Village. And it's really quite a beautiful area. It's got a famous arch, and then there's lots of great restaurants and such. And we were walking through the park, and the park itself is located smack dab in the middle of NYU, New York University. So we were walking, through the park and through the general area of Greenwich Village. When we left the park and turned onto Washington Place and Green Street, and we came upon one of the office buildings that NYU uses, and they use it specifically for their Department of Biology and Chemistry. Now, one of the benefits of being married to a history major is when we're on vacation, my wife can spot a historical society plaque from 100 yards away. And as we were passing this building from the opposite side of the street, she spied a historical society plaque. And so we crossed the street to read about the history of this particular building. And for an area that as a kid I have walked through and been around hundreds of times, it just shocked me to learn that this very building I was looking at had such a vital and infamous history, because it was this very building about 120 years ago was the literal site of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, that catastrophe that happened, that was really the one of the true beginning points of a discussion that we really need to do something to protect workers from occupational injury. But just for a little background, that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire had a history of prior unsafe work conditions and infractions. But on that day of March 25th in 1911, a fire broke out due to some oily rags that were left unattended. And the flames and the smoke spread very quickly through the 9th and 10th floors, killing 145 women and children, largely women and children. And it made such an impression on our society, in not just New York, but nationally, that it really began to create the dialogue for future workplace safety rules, as well as national workers' compensation. But to say that our workers' compensation system started the conversation in 1911 would be unfair, because if we go back into deeper history, we see some of the building blocks that we use today in workers' compensation began to emerge almost 4,000 years ago. And one of the earliest pieces of evidence of this occurred in 2050 BC, when the Nippur tablet was discovered, about 100 years ago. And this represented the oldest known written code of law, written law. And it was referred to as the Law of Ur. And when you read the various components of it, and when I say read, we read the translations of it. I don't read ancient Babylonian. But for instance, one of the rules that popped out for me was if a man is led a field to cultivate, but there's no cultivation and it just turns into wasteland, that owner is due some form of compensation. I can't really tell you what a cur of barley is, but it does represent some meaningful form of revenue transfer. But a little closer to workers' compensation was the whole idea of some form of compensation for injury. And here we see one of the examples. If a man cuts off another man's foot, he has to pay 10 shekels for that infraction. So this represented a very early form of justice, where if someone was responsible for that kind of a bodily crime, there has to be some form of compensation. We move forward a few centuries, we come upon something that's a little bit more well known, the Code of Hammurabi, Babylonian code of law with 300 distinct rules and regulations. And it's also sort of the starting point, really, of proportional compensation for particular injuries, noting that most famous of all ancient rules, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then as you read down the other distinct laws, you come up with other things that start to bear some resemblance to our own workers' compensation rules. For instance, if an ox gores a man to death while just passing through the streets in his town, there is no legal basis for a claim. And as we were discussing this is really a very crude and basic twist on the going and coming rule when one goes to work. Sure. But still, a fascinating list of rules that begin to give us a framework for the eventual basis of the workers' compensation system. We flash forward several more centuries, we come upon the Talmud, which took several centuries to complete. And here, this is basically the codification of Jewish law. Some of the earliest known pieces of documentation that really land oral law into something written. And here we found some examples of what we might refer to as the early versions of the grand bargain, such as when an employer is generally not held to be liable for a worker who's harmed during the normal course of employment, there can't really be considered some form of an infraction. Or long-term workers are free from making up work if they're seriously injured or made ill from their work. And then another example, workers are entitled to damages relating to the loss of their income from a workplace injury, whether it's a loss of limb or other illnesses and injuries. And then some early evidence of some thinking along employer liability, such as when would an employer be responsible for injuries that occur during the normal, the normal activities of work, beginning to set up some bumper guards, some ground rules as to the responsibilities and the give and take between an employer and an employee. So I wanted to just throw a question at you two. When I was learning a little bit about the rules and elements of the Talmud and how it was used, I was told by a friend about some of the more frequent injuries incurred by ancient clergy when working in synagogues and churches. And I was wondering if you wanted to take a guess as to what were the two most popular forms of workplace injury experienced by ancient clergy during the course of their normal work.
I would guess something along the lines of sprains, strains, or maybe cuts and bruises.
Rafael?
No iPhones back then, huh, Alex? So nothing having to do with technology like we've got today.
Nothing like that.
I don't know. I'm interested.
The two more common injuries of ancient clergy that we know about were severe respiratory illness from breathing in too much incense. That was one. And orthopedic fractures from having large stone tablets fall on you.
So, wasn't too far off.
No. We have our own. Today we have our own respiratory and respiratory illnesses and fractures and sprains, but nothing relating to incense and stone tablets.
Interesting.
Wow, that really is. That makes a lot of sense too.
If we flash forward into the 1870s in Germany, there was the issue of growing labor unrest due to, just labor management disagreements and workers demanding more rights and more protections. And Otto von Bismarck, who was the chancellor of Germany at that time, was a very astute politician, and he could read what was going on. And so he took it as an important step to start to create a formal, what we would refer to now as workers' compensation system. Next up, in 1871, we find the real advances in codifying what we refer to as workers' compensation rules and laws. It occurred in Germany in 1871 when a very astute Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, was experiencing his citizenry with a growing amount of labor unrest. There was a lot of worker dissatisfaction with their rights and their compensation, and what would happen to them if they were injured during the course of their work. And so Otto von Bismarck was on point to create two important bills that really began to establish the modern framework of workers' compensation: the Employers' Liability Law, as well as the Sickness Bill and Workers' Accident Insurance Bill, all which provided certain protections to injured workers if they were injured during the normal course of work, and also created a sliding scale, a graduated indemnity benefit system based on that injured worker's, the severity of their injury. Great Britain, being relatively close in proximity to Germany, was not oblivious to some of the solutions as put forward by Otto von Bismarck, and they created their own model, codified by the Employers' Liability Act of 1880 and the Workers' Compensation Act of 1897 and 1906, expanding some of the rules for compensation, a graduated benefit system based on the severity, and that employers were required to cover those costs for medical care as well as lost wages. We turn stateside now to the United States in 1908, where our president, Theodore Roosevelt, began to establish some rules that would cover federal and private employees. In 1908, the Federal Employees Liability Act protected railroad workers at an important time when our railroad system was really expanding coast to coast. Because prior to that, those kinds of catastrophic injuries from railroad calamities left injured workers unprotected and uncompensated. It was expanded further on Roosevelt's interest in this area when he addressed Congress and said that the fact that government employees are not covered was an outrage, and that we needed to create a system where government would ultimately be responsible for such occupational injuries. And that was in 1908. And then in 1910, the Federal Employees Compensation Act, or FECA, legislation to provide explicit workers' compensation protections for federal employees. There were the beginnings of graduated schedules based on the type of injuries that occurred, and it also passed several challenges all the way up to the Supreme Court. So here we are at the beginnings of a recognized compensation system for occupational injury. Next up was my personal hero, Crystal Eastman, who was a investigative reporter in Pennsylvania who conducted what many consider to be the first meta-analysis on workplace injury. And it was such an important piece of research because it really showed for the first time a true fact-based economic analysis of how workplace injuries would occur and how lifetime earning power could be assessed by different types of severities, different types of injuries. And in the bargain, also challenged the whole notion that it was the employee that was really most often responsible for the workplace injury. This work really challenged that and shifted our thinking in terms of responsibility and equity between how we can protect injured workers and how we can also protect employers from too much unnecessary friction and through lawsuits.
So,
In
so
1930
Alex, sorry to interrupt again, but going back to Crystal Eastman, she's also one of my personal favorites. That was not, so what she did was really uncommon at that time. I mean, first of all, to have a woman attorney in those days was really odd, right? And if I remember correctly, she was looking quite a lot into the unsafe working conditions and particularly into the coal mines, right? Is that part of what she did with the
Yes,
analysis?
you did a lot of hands-on investigation as well as developing databases of such injuries and the after effects.
Very interesting.
In 1913, a little closer to my home in California, a few years later in 1913, the California Industrial Accident Board established the rehabilitation theory. And this was before the actual workers' compensation system began. And it just very simply stated that when a workman has sustained an industrial injury, he can or cannot should be able to rehabilitate their earning capacity. And it had some nuance in it that said age and their occupation of the injured worker should be considered, and that the rehabilitation process should attempt to make them as whole as possible. And if they cannot be rehabilitated, they must be pensioned for life. So this is really one of the early examples of really getting very specific in terms of the elements of helping injured workers recover from occupational injury. After the California Industrial Board created these rules, or simultaneously, workers' compensation began to take on more formality with research organizations and rate-making organizations that we've all come to know and enjoy and consider as important colleagues, beginning with IAIBC in 1914, and the other important organizations such as our California Bureau, NCCI, the WCRI in Cambridge, as well as our own organization in California, as well as CHEESWICH. Following the research and rate-making organizations, we also experienced an expansion of commentary in trade press and blogs and podcasts. Workers' Comp Executive, Workers' Comp Central, all the way through 2001's debut of Deconstructing Workers' Comp, now in your 5th year.
Hey, look at that. Look at that. We're making history here.
Big
How about
that? Thanks, Alex.
So with this rollout and with this interest in forming what would be considered a no-fault insurance system between the employer and the employee, there was a national rollout, each state creating their own workers' compensation system. And so it's always been fun to look at interstate comparisons on a couple of key dimensions. And we'll just start with something as vital as the care and treatment of injured workers with permanent partial claim frequency, the differences across states. And here we see in a heat map the various frequencies for PPD claims, California being bright red. There isn't another state that comes as close to our frequency as California. But there's a lot of variability elsewhere. California is also number one in terms of the expense related to delivering a dollar's worth of benefits. And in terms of premium rates, California used to be number one, but now we are number 3. But that really begs the question, if we're all sort of on the same page as to protecting injured workers and creating a no-fault system, how can there be such variability? And this is a question that we at the Institute have been looking into for our entire history of 61 years. So we are a research organization, but we're not completely nerdy. You know, we watch TV and we go to the movies and other cultural things. But one of the more popular topics of conversation around our office is the program Mythbusters, where you take a commonly held belief and then you put it to the test. And there are a multitude of myths in our workers' compensation system. And so we like to look at the strength of those myths, whether in fact they are true or just simply not true. And we measure that through a variety of statistical tests. The most famous, most often one used is correlation, which measures the strength of a relationship between different variables. These two pictures represent two different types of relationships. The one off to the left shows the scattergram of results on a particular issue. Doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it. It's just too scattered. But the one off to the right shows a much more tighter relationship. So we would call that a more positive correlation. But it's also important to resist the temptation of looking at a correlation such as, well, perhaps age and earning power, and saying that that's a causation, whether or not, to say that age causes differences in earning power. There was a famous list of other correlations that sound like fun, but actually show a good correlation, such as I remember one, there was a very strong correlation between the length of Hillary Clinton's hair and the price of gasoline.
Oh my goodness. I don't remember that.
I love it.
So you have to just be careful that when you find a situation that you don't jump to the natural the natural conclusion that one was in fact causing the other. So let's play a little game with you two. This is our myth busting game, where we'll ask you a couple of questions about some long-held myths in our system, and whether or not, after some research, it turns out to be true, or in fact it is a myth. And the first one we'll just talk about is bureaucracy, the red tape effect. Do states with larger workers' compensation regulatory agencies, are they associated with higher costs? The bigger the bureaucracy, the higher the cost. Do you think that's a myth, or do you think it's true?
Must be true. I'm thinking it's true. I'm thinking that's got to be true.
No, I say it's a myth.
Well, as it turns out, leveraging some data, I'm looking at the relationship between premium rate and the size of a agency's staff, as well as their budget. There is absolutely no relationship between the size of the bureaucracy and how expensive that particular state's workers' compensation system is. Okay, so interesting differences between your two guesses. Let's try another one. Politics, red state and blue state. There is a commonly held belief that liberal states have more generous benefits and hence higher costs. What do you think?
True.
Well, I'm going to say true, because we seem to be taking the heat for it all the time. So did I just identify myself as being a liberal? Oops, I might have done that.
Well, I understand your thinking. However, there's really no evidence that it is true between voter registration by party and workers' compensation costs. As you can see from the scattergram, it's kind of all over.
Interesting.
Let's try another one. Fee schedules, medical fee schedules. States with lower medical fee schedules are associated with lower medical costs per claim.
That is a myth.
True. It's got to be true.
Nope.
It really doesn't have to be true. There's very little relationship between where a state sets its fee schedule and the average medical costs per PD claim. Let's try one more.
All right, Alex, I need this one because I'm 0 for 3. Oh my goodness.
It's not looking good for you. Last up, lawyers, justice. States with more attorneys are associated with more litigation and higher rates.
That is true.
Yeah, that's got to be true.
Attorneys.
Well, Rafael, you've been saved from.
Finally, Alex.
It is true. In fact, in the dozens of different variables that we looked at, nothing came close to the strength of the relationship between the number of attorneys per thousand in a given state and their premium rate. So it just goes to show you some myths are, have a basis in reality.
Interesting.
So Alex,
And with that, I'll just close up to answer the first question, where we started. We've always believed that the history of our system, it's just vitally important to understand where it came from and how we arrived at our current level of rules and regulations. That again, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was a slow build over some 4,000 years of history.
So yeah, so going back to where we started of asking why is it important to look at the history. Thank you so much, Alex. This was a really informative presentation, and I love the fun, the gaming part of it as well. So thank you for making it interesting. I think it's just, it's a great testament to the fact that, this has been something that's evolved over time, and humans change over time. The work has changed over time, but the essence of the workers' compensation system, which I think folks that are new to the system tend to struggle with, like, why is it so complicated, and why can't I just find an answer in black and white? And the answer is, well, it's complicated. There's a lot to consider.
There are a lot of moving parts, and in the effort to try to maintain a no-fault system, it's amazing how much effort we put into apportioning the how and why and where and when a particular injury occurred. So it has become more complicated and explains a lot of the differences between one state and another. Different priorities, different industry mix, different injury mix. They're all a part of what could explain the outcome variation from one state to another.
And the politics, as you brought up, politics do play a role in how things are regulated and the laws that end up on the books. We'll have different episodes that come along the way this year that explain some of the different state systems and some of the different nuances in the different states. But I mean, the bottom line is what? The workers' compensation system, you referred to the grand bargain, and even the foundation of that goes way back. So, but it's a bargain between the employer and the employee. And Ralph, why don't you just articulate what that bargain is? What is the grand bargain?
So before comp, an employee essentially had a right to sue his or her employer for negligence, right? If the result of the accident and the cause of the accident was that employer's fault, I had a right to sue my employer under civil remedies, right? Comp, the bargain was, in exchange for giving up that right, comp would now pay for a set of indemnity and medical benefits that were certain to the employee. So no longer did you have to prove that causative factor. It was an automatic, no-fault type of benefit structure. That's the grand bargain. I give up the right to sue you civilly for potentially a greater number of dollars in exchange for a consistent set of benefits, indemnity and medical, right, that would be provided without having to prove the causation factor. That's
and what that means is indemnity and medical. So basically, the employee gives up the right to sue the employer in exchange for care. They're going to be reimbursed for their medical care and any lost time when they're not able to earn wages. Does that sum it up?
Yep.
And it's a no-fault system.
Right, meaning that you don't have to prove, right, that someone was at fault. You don't have to prove negligence. You don't have to prove that someone did something improper, right? So long as you are an employee of the employer and you had an accident and you were in the course and scope of employment, that gets you in the door.
And therein lies the beginning of the complexity, right? Because we have to establish that there was a course and scope. The person was involved in work for the employer and all those different nuances. So What else would we like to say? I think it's been a really informative foundation to where we are today with our workers' compensation system. Anything else you guys would like to offer?
Alex, I wanted to ask you, what a great presentation of giving us how this incredible thing has come our way. Once it landed in the United States, I mean, not all of the states adopted laws immediately, right? It took a while. Who was the first? Who was the last? How long did it take for all of the states to ultimately, put something on the books?
Oh, you're going to put me on the spot here. I used to be able to rattle off the states in chronological order, but I'm afraid
I'm pretty sure Mississippi was the last state.
California was not the last state, but they were probably in the back third of all the states coming online.
Yeah.
Was it Wisconsin that was the first, and Mississippi was the last, and most of the states in the 20s and the 30s, that sort of came on slowly but surely. Yeah. Love that. Love that. It's such an incredible history, right? It's so interesting. And we all tend to think comp is the same everywhere. And we learned that it isn't, right? It really is state by state. It can be so different. It can have its own nuances, if you will.
Yeah, it is interesting how we've all kind of fallen into this line of work that, no one ever dreams as a kid, to becoming a workers' compensation research analyst.
Are you sure? Are you sure, Alex?
I can only speak from personal experience, but it is a really interesting part of our nation's history, and it should be more part of the history teaching process.
Agreed.
We thank you so much. So to take it full circle, so I introduced you at the beginning. You're the president of CWCI, California Workers' Compensation Institute, and you are one of those entities that you showed on one of the slides. So tell us just in a quick nutshell, what is it? So you do research, and you're doing research based on California, obviously. What else would you like folks to know about CWCI?
CWCI has been around for 61 years, and our mission has remained fairly consistent across those 61 years. Our role is to conduct primary research to help ground the debate in objective commentary and research findings. We are not lobbyists. We're not in governing affairs. We try to take a dispassionate view on cost drivers and various other dynamics in the system to provide our members and other stakeholders like the legislature and regulators with objective findings on the performance of the system.
Well, I have to say, a lot of us do rely on CWCI and other organizations for this important research and data that you bring forth. So thank you for that. And I always like to say, my roots go back way back when I was working for an entity in the early 2000s, Choice Medical Management. It's not around anymore, but we utilized a study that came out of California and CWCI, and it showed the correlation between, it's not a big surprise now, but the fact that the more experienced a physician that was treating workers' compensation patients was, interestingly enough, the better the outcomes. So the higher experience that a physician had, the more positive the outcomes were with the workers' compensation patients.
Also known as the volume-based outcomes effect, or practice makes perfect. It had been a subject of research for several decades, beginning at UCSF in, I believe it was the 1970s. But no one really had the data to really explore whether those same outcomes would hold true in workers' compensation. So we did conduct that study back in, I think it was 2002, and found an undeniable relationship between physicians that had more experience with a particular procedure or injury type against those that did not. And that difference was true for speed of recovery, lower costs, more concordance with treatment, with known evidence-based medicine procedures. It just covered the waterfront. And so I think it it gave various stakeholders some food for thought on how to better design a network or how to guide injured workers to the right kind of treatment.
Well, it was very useful. That's exactly what it was. We were in Florida and we had a specialty network. And so we used that as a basis for letting people know we had a very specialized network, and we used that study as a basis for why we went about doing that. So it was very useful.
Thank you.
Awesome. And so in closing, Alex, what's one takeaway you would like? So again, I said at the beginning, our hope is that we have folks that are new to the industry, new to workers' compensation, listening to us. What is a takeaway that you would like those newcomers to understand about the compensation system, the work comp system?
That it has played and continues to play an extremely important role in the functioning of our country, particularly in the relationship between employers and employees and workplace productivity, in doing the right thing when an injury occurs, and making sure that we can return our injured workers to full functioning whenever possible, and to do it in a fair and objective way.
Thank you. But that's something to take pride in, is that it's a solid part of our country, and it delivers benefits that are useful and helpful to injured workers and their families. So thanks so much for joining us today, Alex. Ralph?
This was fun. I so appreciate the chance to visit with you both.
And we with you, Alex. Thank you so much, not just for doing this today, but for your incredible and amazing leadership for so many years at the Institute. We're grateful for the work that you have done. Absolutely.
It's very kind. Thank you.
Okay, well, until we see you next time, Alex, thanks for joining us, and hasta luego.
Hasta luego.
Till next time.